Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak at the History Festival again. The centenary of the Truce has passed and that of the Anglo-Irish Treaty is fast approaching. But the key to understanding them in many ways is the period just beforehand. The first 6 months of 1921 were the bloodiest of the War of Independence. Over 1,000 people were killed, and for most people, things in Ireland seemed to be getting worse. The vast majority of the population and most of the combatants had no idea how close, or indeed how far, their leaders were from agreeing to a cessation. By the time of the truce, both sides could claim successes, but the IRA was under increasing pressure and British military leaders were sure that they were close to victory. Partition was already in place, on the statute books at least, and the violence in Belfast and other parts of the 6 counties was intense and did not end with the truce in July. In fact, that also got worse. So I'm going to talk today really about what many see as the Endgame, as the last period of the struggle for independence. Year of 1920 had concluded with Cork in ruins, martial law declared in most of Munster, and over 1,000 people killed that year. November 1920, Bloody Sunday in Dublin, the Kilmichael ambush in Cork, had signalled all-out war was being waged. The British claimed that what was happening in Ireland was small-scale terrorism caused by an unrepresentative murder gang was in tatters. As far as the British press were concerned, the burning of Cork had been their Louvain. They compared it to the destruction of that Belgian city by German forces in 1914. So by the end of 1920, it was very clear across the world that there was a war taking place in Ireland. But as I'll stress, for the majority of people on the ground, it seemed that war was getting worse and that there was no end in sight. Privately, however, behind the scenes, there had already been peace moves. Throughout late 1920, there were contacts between Irish journalists, British Conservative MPs, clergymen, and Sinn Féin leaders such as Arthur Griffith about the possibility of some form of talks. A key figure in late 1920 was the Clare native Archbishop Joseph Patrick Clune of Perth in Australia, who'd been visiting Europe during 1920, visited Ireland. Ironically and tragically, his nephew Conor Clune was among those murdered in Dublin Castle on Bloody Sunday. Clune was asked by the Belfast Home Rule MP Joseph Devlin to accept an invitation to meet the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, and he did so. Clune met Lloyd George and then met some of the Republican leadership and discussed the possibility, as he saw it, of a truce in December 1920. This, in fact, created conditions for a groundswell demanding peace. Several local councils, led by Sinn Féin, and indeed several Sinn Féin representatives, actually began to call for a ceasefire. This in turn, however, was interpreted by Dublin Castle as a sign of weakness. The Chief Secretary, Hamer Greenwood, stressed that as far as he could see, the Republicans were weakening and fragmenting, and now was the time for the authorities to go on an all-out offensive to crush them. General Macready, the commander of the British military in Ireland, agreed, and he argued that martial law across the country and extensive use of the regular British Army could in fact defeat the IRA in 1921. So these hopes of peace are in fact scuppered by the British administration believing that victory was in sight, and the fact that Republicans had even talked about peace was interpreted as a sign of weakness. So during the spring of 1921, violence escalated across Ireland, particularly over much of the south and west. IRA flying columns engaged in much larger attacks on the police and military than before. 11 policemen, mainly black and tans, were killed at Drumkeen in County Limerick in February, the second deadliest ambush of the War of Independence, while 8 British soldiers were killed at Headford Junction in Kerry during March, along with 2 IRA volunteers and 3 civilians. In Cork, there were large ambushes of Crown forces at Coolavig and Clonbannon, but there the British began to use thousands of regular troops as opposed to police or black and tans, backed up by aerial reconnaissance to sweep the countryside. Tom Barry's 3rd Brigade column in Cork managed to fight their way out after being surrounded at Crossbarry, but the Cork IRA suffered serious losses that spring. 12 volunteers were killed, 7 after they'd surrendered when their safe house was surrounded at Clonmolt, and 6 more men were shot dead after capture at Clogheen. And these were particularly bad losses for the most active IRA divisions in the country. So the British begin to use more and more regular troops to see this as purely a military problem and to believe that really they can go on the offensive in parts of Ireland during the spring. They also begin to apply the policy of internment and also legal execution far more than before. Following the execution of Kevin Barry in Dublin during the winter, 23 more IRA men would be put to death in Cork and Dublin during the spring, while several of those captured faced death sentences. Realising the impact that reprisals were having on public opinion in Britain, the military command in Ireland tried to control and refine them. This was only partially successful, so blowing up the homes of Republicans rather than randomly burning shops and pubs. But the British military command were keenly aware, as were people like Sir Henry Wilson in Britain, that from their point of view it was much better to legally execute captured IRA men and to have some form of structure around local reprisals than to allow auxiliaries or black and tans to loot pubs or shops or simply kill people out of hand. Nevertheless, the Crown forces killed at least 380 civilians in 1921. They also targeted Republicans, murdering the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork, Michael O'Callaghan, and his predecessor, George Clancy, during March. Internment without trial, in part based on intelligence from captured IRA documents, saw over 6,000 men imprisoned by the summer of 1921. Now, I have to say, as a historian, anyone studying the War of Independence period is very lucky that the IRA kept such detailed records. But in 1921, this was obviously a negative for the IRA, because the British were able to base their intelligence very often on captured IRA documents and did in fact begin scooping up large numbers of middle-ranking IRA officers throughout the country during the spring of 1921. The British also diversified their tactics, began to utilise their own version of the flying columns, sending out what they called active service platoons to live off the land and pursue the IRA. So as I'll say again later on, both sides are on a very deadly learning curve throughout early 1921, and the violence, as I say, seems to be getting worse. The war also spreads west and north. The most active area in the Irish Midlands, Longford, saw successful engagements for the IRA at Clonfin, but activity there declined very markedly after the local commander, Sean McKeown, was captured. Now, McKeown was sentenced to death for the shooting of a policeman, and they were desperate attempts by the IRA to free him from prison in Dublin in the period right up till the truce, and indeed part of the negotiations around the truce were to try and guarantee that people like McKeown would not be executed. There were successful ambushes of police and troops in areas which had not seen much activity before. So in Mayo, for example, there are ambushes at Tormacady and Carrow Kennedy, but 7 Mayo volunteers are killed in a failed attack at Kilmena. In Leitrim, the IRA suffered a major setback when its flying column under Sean Connolly was wiped out at Selton Hill. Connolly and 6 others were killed. So in many areas, again, the loss of volunteers is a huge setback and makes it very difficult for the IRA to operate. In Belfast, again, almost uniquely, the IRA was engaged in a fierce struggle against Crown forces, including the new Special Constabulary, and also against Loyalists. Civilians, however, in Belfast bore the brunt of the violence, Nationalists suffering particularly after every IRA operation. On the 10th of July 1921, the day before the truce, Loyalists attacked Catholic districts and 25 people were killed, hundreds injured, and over 160 houses burnt. And that day was known as Belfast's Bloody Sunday, occurring just on the eve of the truce. Outside Belfast, IRA units in Ulster often laboured in areas that were largely unionist. Frank Aiken in Armagh, Ona Duffy in Monaghan, and Joe Sweeney in Donegal were among the most active of the local commanders. By 1921, they faced a new opponent, as I've mentioned, in the Ulster Special Constabulary, the Specials, which saw thousands of unionist men, very often ex-servicemen, mobilised to back up police and army. Loyalist violence, opposition to Republicans from Hibernians, the strong arm of the Home Rule movement still significant in Ulster, and overwhelming Crown force strength made operations in Ulster even more difficult than elsewhere. In many parts of the country, even into 1921, IRA activity continued to involve road trenching, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and very small-scale attacks rather than major ambushes. Lack of adequate arms and ammunition remained a constant problem across the entire army. The IRA fought the War of Independence chronically underarmed. By the time of the truce, according to their own figures, they had approximately 3,000 rifles, 5,000 handguns, 60 machine guns of various types, around 15,000 shotguns, for a force numbering between 70 to 100,000 volunteers. So in other words, the vast majority of IRA volunteers did not have access to a firearm. They desperately needed machine guns and mortars in order to attack large barracks, which they were not really able to do. And the increasing use by the British of armour and air power were also major challenges, particularly with the equipment that the IRA had to deal with. Smuggling was constant, but often on a very small scale, just 1 or 2 guns at a time brought to Dublin from Liverpool, for example. Major shipments were attempted or planned from Italy, the Soviet Union, Germany and the United States, but none came to fruition. The capture of almost 500 Thompson guns at Hoboken, New Jersey in June was a huge blow. There had been extensive plans and high hopes for the impact of this weapon. Michael Collins had written to Harry Boland that their arrival would go a fair way towards winning the war here. What he called the heartbreaking seizure of the guns illustrated that the intelligence war was not only being fought in Ireland. IRA GHQ certainly felt that there'd been leaks in the United States about this shipment and that British intelligence was able to take advantage of this, though the story of the Thompsons is convoluted, to say the least. Nevertheless, Sean Hogan of IRA GHQ later reflected that while at home our people are much more reticent and guarded in their statements, while in America our people are talkative. The British Secret Service made much greater headway against our organisation in America than in Ireland. So it's important to remember again when we talk about this idea of an intelligence war, that this intelligence war is also being waged in Britain and the United States and everywhere where Irish Republicans are active. British intelligence is also active across the globe as well. And this does lead, for example, as I said, to the capture of the Thompson guns, which IRA GHQ had high hopes for and which may have even impacted on their desire to cease activity when they did. As I mentioned earlier, the war had been a very sharp and brutal learning curve for both sides. So the IRA was diversifying by the spring of 1921. In fact, in May, a landmine in a culvert killed 6 British soldiers, members of a regimental band, and wounded over 20 others near Youghal, County Cork. Mines were increasingly used, as were various types of booby traps. In Longford, for example, the IRA booby-trapped a tricolour flag, knowing that Crown forces would remove it if they saw it. This exploded, badly injuring a policeman. Unarmed soldiers who were once off limits were now targeted. After the execution of 6 IRA men in Cork in late February, 12 soldiers were shot in the city, of whom 6 died. Over 200 policemen, including TANs and Auxiliaries, were killed between January and July 1921, while 48 regular soldiers were killed in May and June alone. So while the IRA is suffering setbacks in many parts of the country, they are also upping their activities and causing major casualties for the British forces, particularly increasingly for the regular army, as that's used more in a frontline form. There were also killings of captured policemen and soldiers in retaliation for executions. Unionist big houses were also burnt in retaliation for reprisals, particularly in Cork. The family homes of Auxiliaries and Black and Tans in Britain were attacked, as was commercial and industrial property in Liverpool, Manchester and elsewhere. And again, this does mark a change in tactics. It might surprise people today, but up till the winter of 1920, regular British soldiers still often moved around places like Dublin unarmed, and they weren't attacked. That only began to really happen to a large extent in 1921. Similarly, by 1921 in Cork, the use by British forces of the big houses of the Anglo-Irish as barracks, or their use for socialisation and so on, meant that these houses were targeted by the IRA in reprisals. And you also have this tactic of where IRA volunteers are sentenced to death, the IRA will take prisoners of policemen or soldiers and announce that if executions take place in Dublin or Cork, they will retaliate by killing these men. Now, in terms of the rules of warfare, killing men in reprisal is supposed to be completely out of bounds, but nevertheless, it is happening by 1921. And you also have the extension of IRA activities to Britain. Up till 1921, the IRA in Britain was largely engaged in smuggling, but after the winter of 1920, you have sabotage, the burning of warehouses on Liverpool docks and so on, the destruction of various forms of property, and also attacks on the families of Auxiliaries and Black and Tans. They're able to do that through intelligence, through capturing letters from Britain to British soldiers or British servicemen in Ireland and finding out their home addresses. So there is an acceleration in terms of the violence being used. And the killing of alleged spies and informers also becomes far more common. There's 180 such killings in 1921. Almost 100 of these are in Cork. Several of those killed as spies also have their bodies disappeared. These bodies are not returned to their families, and in fact, they're secretly buried. Now, this again, in many ways, reflects a radicalisation and a brutalisation. The IRA fears that many of its setbacks are due to spies. So in Leitrim, for example, the Selton Hill ambush is blamed on a local Orangeman, and he's subsequently shot by the IRA. In Cork, you also have the case of a loyalist, Mrs. Lindsay, who does give information to the Crown Forces about a planned IRA ambush, and as a result is abducted and later killed along with her chauffeur. Now, this also reflects something else. IRA HQ in Dublin were adamant that she not be shot. Female spies were not supposed to be killed. The IRA in Cork kill her secretly, bury her secretly, and it's only after the truce that the IRA leadership in Dublin find out that she was in fact killed, and her body was never discovered. Dublin, of course, was the centre of revolutionary government, of IRA GHQ, and Michael Collins' squad famously had targeted Dublin Castle's intelligence network since 1919. And the IRA had mounted devastating attacks on British officers on Bloody Sunday in November 1920. But the city, as I've mentioned, didn't see widespread attacks on regular army and police until 1921. British intelligence in the city, it's important to say, was reorganised after Bloody Sunday. A group of officers led by an Irish police inspector, Eugene Igo, began to hunt Collins, Mulcahy and the IRA staff. And the IRA never got to grips with what they called the Igo gang. So the city was extremely heavily policed, and this made IRA activity often very difficult. The police also successfully captured thousands of IRA documents in raids on safe houses, and were able to find out something about the structure of the movement across the country. In January 1921, the IRA in Dublin then set up an active service unit from the city's 4 battalions. Numbering over 100 men, by spring they were carrying out daily attacks. These were small groups of men armed with handguns and grenades usually, who carried out ambushes where possible of Crown forces in the city, and who essentially had license to carry out ambushes by day or by night. The majority of IRA volunteers in the city, again, as elsewhere in the country, didn't have ready access to arms or grenades, and they were engaged in intelligence or in other work. So during the spring of 1921 in Dublin, dozens of soldiers, auxiliaries and policemen were killed by the IRA Active Service Unit. But the IRA in the city also suffered its own losses, as did increasingly the civilian population. At least 46 people, including children, were killed in crossfire or by explosions by the spring of 1921. And again, the IRA's grenade attacks often failed because they were making these grenades themselves. They either didn't go off, or sometimes they bounced off military vehicles into the street and killed or injured passer-bys. The difficulty the IRA faced in the city is illustrated by events on the 14th of March 1921 on Great Brunswick Street, what is now Pearse Street. 6 IRA volunteers had been executed that morning in Mountjoy, and the Dublin Brigade planned several operations in retaliation for this. They were gathering at what's now the library on Pearse Street to get weapons and grenades for the night's missions. However, intelligence reached the Crown forces, and a patrol of auxiliaries arrived on the scene. 2 IRA volunteers, 2 auxiliaries, including one who'd been an acting general in the Great War, and 3 civilians were killed in a wild gun battle. And the IRA's handguns were no match for heavily armed and motorised military patrols armed with rifles and Lewis guns, for example. So an IRA volunteer who was captured after the battle, Thomas Traynor, was then hanged in Mountjoy in April, while a policeman, Inspector Gilbert Potter, who was being held hostage by the IRA in Tipperary, was executed in response. Having rarely killed civilians in Dublin until 1921, in the spring of that year, the IRA killed over 20 alleged informers in the city. So again, in Dublin, things are getting worse as they are elsewhere. Now, the Dublin Brigade also attempted a number of what would be called, in modern parlance, spectaculars. There was an attack on Q Company of the Auxiliaries at the Northwestern Railway Hotel on Dublin's Quays in April 1921. Q Company of the Auxiliaries was made up of former naval or Royal Marine personnel, and it was engaged in essentially attempting to keep the Dockland area safe for the Crown forces and also prevent smuggling. Their opposite numbers in the IRA and the docks were also called Q Company. The IRA decided to attack the auxiliaries at the hotel, which was their headquarters, using mines and explosives, and they planned a major offensive. However, this didn't work out as planned. There was a huge gun battle in which an IRA volunteer was killed, but the Auxiliaries got off relatively lightly. Again, if you Google Auxiliaries, Northwestern Hotel or so on, you will see a picture of a group of Auxiliaries looking very happy in the aftermath of the gun battle, and obviously adrenalised as well, given what had taken place. There were also plans then in Dublin for what was called the Great Shoot-'em-Up, an attack on Crown forces across Dublin city centre in Grafton Street and elsewhere, where essentially every British soldier, auxiliary or policeman who was on the streets would be shot. This was only called off because of the truce in July 1921. You also have the use of the Thompson gun for the first time in attacks. There's an attack on a troop train at Drumcondra in June, and also another attack on British military on board a train at Ballyfermot. Now, the results are very mixed. The Thompson gun jams in Drumcondra. It's clear again that the volunteers need more time to train, and in Ballyfermot, a civilian is shot dead. But of course, it shows you that there were plans to use this weapon in an urban setting. And then, of course, the biggest spectacular of all in many ways is the Custom House operation. Eamon de Valera was very conscious as Sinn Féin president of the need for a major headline-grabbing operation in Dublin ahead of potential talks. In many ways, this is a way to show the British that you're not on the defensive, that you actually still have cards to play. Against the more cautious instincts of Collins and Mulcahy, de Valera pushed for the destruction of the Custom House, the centre of local government in Ireland. So on the 25th of May 1921, over 200 Dublin IRA volunteers, the active service unit backed up by others, seized and successfully set fire to the building and its records. But British forces responded quicker than anticipated, and in again a major gun battle, 5 IRA volunteers and 3 civilians were killed. And here again you have a case where most of the IRA members are armed with handguns or grenades. The auxiliaries and so on arrive in armoured vehicles or in trucks with Lewis guns and with rifles. The IRA in Dublin barely used rifles because they were too unwieldy for a city setting, but it gave the British obviously a major advantage in any kind of gunfight. And 5 volunteers, as I say, are killed, but more than 80 men are captured, which is a major loss for the Dublin Brigade because many of their most active volunteers are then imprisoned. Following the attack, you have the amalgamation of the active service unit and the squad into a single Dublin Guard. There'd been 107 IRA attacks in Dublin during May. This number fell to 93 in June, reflecting in many ways the setbacks suffered at the Custom House. But again, debate still rages about how successful or not this operation was. Certainly it gained again both national and international attention. The fact that the IRA could strike in the centre of Dublin, could destroy a symbol of British local government in Ireland was hugely symbolic and significant, and it brought it home to people that a war was still going on in Ireland. But the Dublin IRA certainly suffered heavy losses for that attack. Important to stress always, particularly when we talk in terms of the military struggle, that this is only part of the story. The Irish War of Independence was a popular revolution, and right throughout this period you have Dáil Éireann still attempting to continue to build a counter-state in Ireland. You've got Dáil courts functioning across the country. You've got the Republican police, again often forgotten that there is an entirely separate police force established by the Dáil, which is operating in different parts of Ireland in contrast to the boycott of the British Crown and their police. You've got local councils, mostly under Sinn Féin control. Their funding is cut in 1921 because of support for Sinn Féin, but they still try to carry on the local business of government. You've got a Belfast boycott in support of nationalists in that city, which sees various attempts to try and cut off trade with Belfast, a very controversial tactic and one that there's still quite a lot of questions about, but nevertheless it's taking place throughout 1921. You still have the involvement of the labour movement in the struggle for independence. So for example, in April in Dublin, when there are executions in Mountjoy, there's a half-day general strike called by the trade unions in protest. Outside of Dublin, you have continuing strikes and land agitation, dozens of local Soviets, particularly in Munster with the takeover of creameries and so on, continuing land agitation in the West in particular. And right across the world then, you've got the Dáil and its diplomats active in trying to push the Republican case for independence. In Paris, in Spain, in Catalonia, in the Vatican, in Italy, in Germany, the Soviet Union, and across the British Empire, you've got Republicans active in various ways. From Canada and Newfoundland to New Zealand and South Africa, the Irish diaspora in these countries are mobilised. And of course, in the United States, you've got several million more dollars raised for Irish relief efforts during 1921. And this is separate from the $5 million which had been raised for the Dáil bonds before that. You also have continuing connections between Irish revolutionaries and their counterparts in India and Egypt, meeting in cities like New York, San Francisco, and London and Berlin. And you also, by 1921, have the IRA giving military advice to Egyptian and Indian revolutionaries too. So this is a popular revolution, both in Ireland and across the world. So when we talk about it, we shouldn't just concentrate on the military angle, important though that is, but see actually that the idea of Irish independence was firmly established across the globe, and people were well aware that something important was happening in Ireland. Behind the scenes, by the spring of 1921, again, you have contacts about talks. So Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, meets Father Michael O'Flanagan, the Sinn Féin Vice President, and a man called Lord Justice O'Connor during January 1921. The British government privately and British intelligence believed that Eamon de Valera and Arthur Griffith were the moderates within the Republican movement, and Collins and his allies were seen as hardliners. And that's the way they tended to think right up until the truce. But during the spring of 1921, there are attempts again to reach out privately to elements within Sinn Féin. The Southern Unionists, Catholic Church and Labour leaders are all involved in attempts to set up talks. Southern Unionists in particular fear the impact of partition, fear what will happen if Ireland is divided, as it is due to be under the Government of Ireland Act, and some of their leaders, such as Arthur Jemison, the distiller from Dublin, is involved in trying to broker talks between Sinn Féin and the British government. In Britain, there are those who are, of course, in favour of fighting this to the bitter end. The so-called British Conservative diehards in Parliament and elsewhere are against any concessions or any talks. They are convinced that Sinn Féin represents an existential threat to the British Empire, are essentially the tools of the Bolsheviks. People like Sir Henry Wilson argue if we lose Ireland, we lose the empire, and then we'll end up losing England itself. Lloyd George, a Liberal, represented only a minority in a Tory and Unionist-dominated coalition, which right up to the spring of 1921 does seem to believe that victory is possible in Ireland. The British military, on the one hand, are confident of their abilities to crush the IRA, but they're also very aware of the drain on their efforts of their efforts in India, Egypt, the Middle East, and so on. The British Empire has emerged from the war bigger than ever, but it's also finding it difficult to deal with upsurges in demands for independence and sovereignty across the globe. So they would like to see something settled in Ireland too. Some of the hardliners within the military believe in either get out or all out. In other words, all out war or find a settlement. And that's the way they're thinking into the summer. The Government of Ireland Act allowed for the creation of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. The term Northern Ireland, obviously, we're still very much aware of, but the 26 counties were to be called Southern Ireland under this settlement. And in May 1921, there are elections for the Northern and Southern Parliaments. The British government did consider calling off these elections or allowing a truce to let them go ahead. In the end, they allowed the elections go ahead without a truce, which means Sinn Féin faces no opposition in the 26 counties. The Home Rule Party and Labour don't contest the election there. Sinn Féin refuses to attend the Southern Parliament, and the British indeed discussed declaring the 26 counties a crown colony under martial law in response, but nevertheless Sinn Féin successfully stand and takes 124 seats in the Southern Irish Parliament. That becomes what we call the Second Dáil, and this essentially is the body that will be debating the treaty in 6 months' time. Now, this Second Dáil included many military leaders. It included for the first time more women than Countess Markievicz. There are now 6 women TDs. The Unionists won just 4 seats. They took 4 seats in Dublin University, and so the Southern Irish Parliament, which Sinn Féin refuses to recognise, is made up almost entirely of Sinn Féin TDs. The Northern Irish Parliament in the 6 counties sees Unionists winning 40 seats, Sinn Féin winning 6, and the Home Rule Party winning 6. So quite clearly nationalists are going to be a minority in this Parliament if they ever decide to take part in it. The Unionists obviously win the election there. But the election again does concentrate minds. Sinn Féin obviously have overwhelming popular support in much of Ireland. And within the British establishment there are now diverse voices. General Neville Macready, who had been in favour of a hard line during the winter, now begins to counsel caution and argues that a political solution is necessary in Ireland, that a military solution will not work or will in fact be too costly in terms of wider imperial policy. A key figure in British thinking is actually General Jan Smuts of South Africa, who advises Lloyd George to make a public offer of Dominion status to Irish Republicans. Now, Smuts had been a guerrilla commander during the Boer War and had fought the British. Then he'd become leader of the nationalists in South Africa and of course had fought on Britain's side in the Great War. So he has both a status among the Irish, and he's well known, but also is regarded as a key ally by the British too. Smuts writes at least some of the text for King George V's conciliatory speech when King George opens the Northern Parliament in June in Belfast. He makes a speech in which he hopes there will be a satisfactory solution to the age-old Irish problem and essentially signals that he is in favour of peace in Ireland. This is on the 22nd of June. In retrospect, many people read a great deal into the King's speech. On the ground, of course, the reaction is quite different. There'd been a major show of British military strength in Belfast for the opening of the Northern Parliament and for the arrival of the King. On their way back to Dublin, a British Army troop train is derailed by the IRA near Newry. 3 soldiers and a railway guard are killed, and over 80 horses also die in the ambush. So the initial reaction of Republicans to the King's speech is not necessarily one that sees it as offering a breakthrough, but in retrospect people do see the speech as significant. The British government then publicly invite De Valera and the Northern Premier James Craig to talks. De Valera declines the invitation and seeks talks directly with the British government. Now, De Valera had met Craig in Dublin during May for a very inconclusive talks, but nevertheless he argues that as the leader of majority Irish opinion, he should be talking directly to the British government. Southern Unionists again become involved in trying to broker these talks, and throughout June you've got the release of selected prisoners, Arthur Griffith, Desmond Fitzgerald and Owen MacNeill and so on, let go essentially by the British to show that they're in favour of some kind of talks. There are meetings between Robert Barton and Eamon Duggan on behalf of the IRA with General Macready, and ultimately a truce is agreed on the 9th of July, and it comes into effect on the 11th of July 1921. A couple of days later, De Valera does meet Lloyd George. Now this, in world historical terms, in terms of Irish history, is obviously very dramatic. De Valera, who'd been regarded as the leader of a murder gang by conservatives in Britain, and by British opinion more generally sometimes, is meeting the British Prime Minister by July. On the ground, of course, the reaction is quite different. Ernie O'Malley, in his book On Another Man's Wound, gives a very evocative description of how he hears about the truce as an IRA officer on the run. He says, "On the 9th of July, a Dublin boy, Paddy O'Connor, came to Mrs. Quirke's house whilst I was away. A dispatch rider was sent for me. The boy would not tell his business to any other member of the staff. He handed me a typed order. Quotes, in view of the conversations now being entered into by our government with the government of Great Britain, and in pursuance of mutual conversations, active operations by our troops will be suspended as from noon, Monday, 11th of July. Richard Mulcahy, Chief of Staff." Then O'Malley said, "And so ended for us what we called the scrap. The people, later on the trouble, and others fond of labels, the revolution." So in many ways, it's a kind of low-key way in which O'Malley finds out about the truce. And this is the way the IRA on the ground does find out about the truce. And then obviously the general public become aware of it as well. And you might note that in the movie The Wind That Shakes the Barley, there's a scene that's kind of closely modelled on that description. Between January 1917 and December 1921, it's estimated there were over 2,140 deaths in Ireland. Responsibility for them seems to have been the IRA, responsible for about 46% of fatalities, the Crown Forces for 42%, maybe 8 or 9% we're not sure of, unknown. Almost 1,000 civilians killed, 1,200 combatants, nearly 500 IRA volunteers, over 500 policemen, over 260 British soldiers. Now these figures are still unclear, although we were becoming more and more aware of the actual cost of the Irish Revolution. Nevertheless, for a country with a population of just over 4 million, this was of course an intensely traumatic and tragic period, and thousands of others were affected severely in many ways. And this is why, of course, that for the general public, news of a truce is greeted very often with jubilation and with relief. But reaction among the IRA on the ground is sometimes quite different. Ernie O'Malley asked, why had the truce been ordered? We were gaining ground. Each day strengthened us and weakened our enemy. Why then was it necessary to put a stop to hostilities? A Monaghan IRA volunteer remembered, to say that we were jubilant would be untrue. It was more bewilderment. Another officer described his men's response as a mixture of satisfaction and disappointment. Disappointment that the possible end had come before we'd achieved anything worthwhile, and joy in the hope that we would now have a chance of getting properly armed and meeting the Tans on level terms. On the other hand, Bridget Lyne Thorns of Cumanamon in Dublin said, we were happy and excited with the truce. We went mad. The hoardings were torn down on O'Connell Street and we all roamed the streets. The curfew was lifted, the lid was off, and we all enjoyed ourselves. It was like the Mardi Gras. Now, here you have, of course, activist reactions influenced in many ways by the split and subsequent civil war. On the ground in some areas, the IRA may have thought it was winning, but at GHQ, the picture often seemed very different. And among the general public, those not directly involved in the Republican struggle, widespread relief seems to have been the overwhelming feeling, particularly outside Belfast, where unfortunately the truce only lasted for a few hours. In many ways, the violence continued. The truce itself had contradictory effects. It didn't bring peace because Ireland still remained very unsettled and people were still killed across the country into the winter of 1921. And as I stressed, violence continued at a high level in Belfast and other parts of Ulster. But the IRA was able to reorganise, to expand, and some within it certainly felt that they had been close to achieving victory, or that victory might be within grasp. Gun running was stepped up during the winter, for example, and the IRA by 1922 is better armed than it had been during the War of Independence. At GHQ, many people like Richard Mulcahy, for example, are far more pessimistic. They regard it as a miracle that the IRA had held on as long as it did. Certainly what the truce does in many ways is have a demobilising impact on the general population. The general population, ordinary people, do feel the war is over, as indeed do much of the Irish diaspora. You begin to see in Britain and America and elsewhere a feeling that the Irish question is effectively being settled, and therefore people aren't as keen to return to such a struggle. Later on, Sean Moylan of the IRA argued that during the truce period, at least some IRA volunteers and officers displayed public indiscipline, began to take advantage of their new status, and in fact contributed to a cynicism about the IRA, which later on backfired on the organisation. The Republican movement in many ways had always been a fairly brittle coalition around concepts of republicanism and sovereignty, between people who'd been active in Sinn Féin for years and between people who'd arrived after the Easter Rising, between the secretive Irish Republican Brotherhood and the more open Irish volunteers. There were divisions around class and around gender, around aspects of military service and attitudes to the military war and so on. And once the truce happened, these differences begin to become more visible and the movement begins to splinter. What did the truce actually represent? What was on offer? Could war actually be resumed? Are all debated during the winter of 1921. A man called Patrick Little, a Republican, writing in a journal called Old Ireland, was in many ways very perceptive in August 1921 when he argued essentially what had happened is that what turned England towards peace was that it seemed to her that she had more to gain from peace than from war. England does not move by emotion or by impulse or by accident. Our governing class is the cleverest governing class in the world. The IRA has caught her at a time when her international position is anything but secure, when her empire, vaster than ever, covering more of the map, is yet capable of very quick disintegration. That is the whole secret of it. There is no possible way of reconciling the respective claims and jealousies of Japan and the great Western powers, and sooner or later will come a war between Europe and Asia. England has to choose between them, and she wants to choose Europe. She can go to the Washington Conference with Ireland still at war with her, but she would rather not. That is all. For once the stars in their courses have fought for us. For once we hold the whip hand. And it's very perceptive because he's arguing that the British are looking at the global picture and what Ireland means for them in terms of their relations with America and so on. And while the conservative diehards in Britain denounced any talks as surrender to a murder gang. Others, more perceptive, such as Lord Samuel Hoare, reassured Parliament that the British Empire does not surrender to anyone. We are so strong that we can make big and generous concessions to Ireland. But it was also vital that the Irish problem, as the British saw it, was solved on Britain's terms. Or as Winston Churchill explained, it's important to bring an end to this tiresome Irish business. Our whole army is tethered to Ireland. Our great interests in India and Egypt are sensibly affected by that weakness. So were our interests all over the world, especially in our dominions and in the United States. They were affected by the reproach directed against us and by the loud outcry raised by the Irish race all over the world. Churchill believes if we can somehow bring this to an end, then this will benefit us on the international stage. Of course, there are major problems still here. What's to happen with Northern Ireland? What's to happen with partition? But the British also see an opportunity for a settlement that keeps Ireland within the empire and doesn't concede it the independence which people had voted for in 1918 and what Republicans believed was the essence of sovereignty. The British, sometimes it's often said that the Irish were obsessed about things like the Oath of Allegiance. It's actually the British who are obsessed by the Crown, by the Oath of Allegiance, by keeping Ireland within the imperial framework in any settlement. And if an agreement is reached, Lloyd George says, if there is a treaty, for the first time in the history of our treatment of Ireland, if the treaty is broken by Ireland, the civilised world will say England is blameless. It would be a source of strength to us, which would be invaluable if the time to re-invade ever came. So the British are thinking of a settlement which will put the onus essentially on the Irish. And if there is trouble in Ireland, it will in future be blamed on the Irish and not on them. By the summer of 1922, after the Anglo-Irish Treaty has been signed, the Irish Republican movement has fatally split over the treaty. And Frank Aiken, the IRA leader, laments how we find ourselves through the trickery of our common enemy in two camps, using all our talents and energy in fighting, abusing and maligning each other. We are the same men. The difference is that war with the foreigner brings to the fore all that is best and noblest in a nation, civil war, all that is mean and base. Now the question of the civil war is for another day. But it is very important, I think, to remember that this is not just an Irish question or an Irish problem. That British imperial power and the threat of war plays a huge role in the discussions about the treaty and in ultimately why people take the sides they do and in bringing Ireland essentially back into conflict in the summer of 1922. Thank you.